B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, October 16th, 2020, 19 days to the November 3rd election. And finally, we're seeing that some of the rats recognize they are on a sinking ship. And can they save their own asses? Well, that's the attempt that is underway in some quarters. And Ben Sasse is this first-term senator from Nebraska. He's only 48 years old. He served as a college president. He's clearly a very smart man. But he's a movement conservative. And while he has not been an out-and-out Trump supporter, he has been an enabler, an aider and abettor. And as the good ship Trump hits the shoals, and the astute observers, even in Republican quarters, recognize that he appears to be going down, Ben Sasse demonstrates his advanced skills at double talk. So on the one hand, yesterday he held a town hall telephone conference call with as many as 17,000 Nebraskans. And when one caller said, "I'm trying to understand your relationship with the president. Why do you have to criticize him so much?" Ben Sasse went on a 9-minute rant, and he offered up criticisms of Trump, some of which you have heard from me. He said the senator said the president had mistreated women, alienated important allies around the globe, been a profligate spender, ignored human rights, treated the pandemic like a PR crisis. He said that it looks likely that Republicans like him will face steep repercussions for having backed Trump so staunchly over 4 years. And in the voice of the senator, the debate is not going to be, "Ben Sasse, why were you so mean to Donald Trump?" It's going to be, "What the heck were any of us thinking? That selling a TV-obsessed, narcissistic individual to the American people was a good idea. We are staring down the barrel of a blue tsunami." Now, I try to maintain some humility. You got to be an arrogant egotist to do a podcast. Let's just stipulate that, all right? But I try to keep it in balance. And I don't often pat myself on the back or get into what I call a self-referential mode. But today I will, because for years now, I have been predicting that Republicans will only peel off from Trump and the threat that he will tweet them and bleed them politically when they feel that their own political prospects are directly at risk. And Ben Sasse is up for re-election. 19 days. He is feeling the heat. And he went on to say that he'd worked hard to develop a working relationship with Trump. He prayed for the president. He was pleased when Trump adopted traditionally conservative policy stances and nominated conservative judges. He said, "But I'm not at all apologetic for having fought for my values against his in places where I think his are deficient, not just for a Republican, but for an American." He said that Trump careened from curb to curb as he sought to respond to the pandemic. He refused to treat it seriously. For months, he treated it like a news cycle by news cycle PR crisis. He didn't think Trump's leadership in the crisis has been reasonable or responsible or right. The way he kisses dictators' butts, Sasse continued. I mean, the way he ignores that the Uyghurs are in literal concentration camps in Xinjiang right now. He hasn't lifted a finger on behalf of the Hong Kongers. The United States now regularly sells out our allies under his leadership. The way he treats women, spends like a drunken sailor. Trump mocks evangelicals behind closed doors. His family has treated the presidency like a business opportunity. He's flirted with white supremacists. And one more quote from Ben Sasse. I'm now looking at the possibility of a Republican bloodbath in the Senate. And that's why I've never been on the Trump train. Now, I led this series of quotes from Ben Sasse by calling him a double talker. And the double talk is that he said this at the same time that he was working in concert with Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham to ram through the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. And that bears who I think Ben Sasse really is, and it belies the kind of highfalutin comments that I just quoted liberally to you. And I enjoy getting emails from listeners, and John Zwiebel in Hawaii sent me a note earlier this week. After hearing some comments from Ben Sasse, he said, maybe there's a Republican I could actually vote for. And I responded, oh, wait a minute. Because Ben Sasse is really just the successor to Jeff Flake and Bob Corker. Flake of Arizona, Corker of Tennessee. They both retired rather than face re-election, expecting they would lose to an even further right Republican promoted by Trump. And it was Corker who said you can't poke the bear, referring to Trump. And it was Flake who had these anguished interviews where he'd talk about just how conflicted he is, and this president is, so odious. And then he'd turn around and vote for whatever Trump told him to. The only difference is that Ben Sasse knows that he might lose because even though he was not a through-and-through Trump supporter, he is tainted by his association with the Republican majority in the Senate and the dirty work that they've done. Now, this comes very close to the election. People are already voting. Nearly 20 million people across the country have already cast a ballot, either at early voting at the polls or by submitting a mail-in ballot. So does this come too late to turn the tide? I don't know. But the polling shows that Sasse is fairly safe in Nebraska, but his Republican colleagues in many battleground states are not in the same position. So last night, I think it actually turned out pretty well. Despite all the comments and complaints from the chattering class, Joe Biden did a town hall on ABC, moderated by George Stephanopoulos. Donnie Trump did a town hall in Miami with Savannah Guthrie of NBC and the Today Show. Now, one of the things that was predicted yesterday, smugly, by Rush Limbaugh, was that the reasons that people were objecting to NBC's decision to put Trump on in a town hall in the slot where the face-to-face debate had been scheduled and then scuttled by Trump. And as I explained yesterday, I didn't think that it was that big a deal, and there were some regulatory reasons why NBC, in many respects, didn't have a lot of choice. But Rush Limbaugh was chortling that, they just know that Trump's going to kill Biden in the ratings. Nobody cares about plugs. That's a reference to his hair transplants, in case that you're not familiar with that one. That's Rush's favorite derogatory tag for Biden. Anyway, the numbers are in. And essentially, 1 million more people watched Joe Biden on ABC than those who watched on NBC, MSNBC, and CNBC, the Trump town hall. And I'm sure the guy who cares about his crowd size and whether his hands are big enough and his junk is big enough, I'm sure that hurts more than any policy point that was made or any bruises he may have gotten in the aggressive questioning from Savannah Guthrie. And I ended up watching the NBC town hall on YouTube, which had a gazillion comments, mostly posted by MAGA people, but a few critics. And they were just blistering in their criticism of Savannah Guthrie. And I will say that I thought she interrupted Trump a little too much. But after what he did, the rude behavior that he displayed in the first presidential debate in Cleveland, I really don't extend any, special respect to him or criticism of the manners of others who try to dodge in between his lies, his distractions and diversions and insults. So overall, I think Savannah Guthrie did a pretty good job. She did get some news out of the guy. He more or less admitted that he is on the hook for over $400 million in loans linked to his properties. But of course he says, and this is a point I've made, we don't know the actual equity that he has in the properties that carry this debt load. And he claims to be a multi-billionaire, in which case, debts of $400 million are tolerable. But he tended to confirm that, I owe that kind of money, and I'm going to tell you who I owe it to. Now, any of those claims we can't believe. And, of course, he said he's okay with masks. Then he turned around and cited a false figure that 85% of people who have been diagnosed with an illness under COVID had worn a mask. And so he is still trying to minimize and claim that, the virus is going to die any day now, maybe on November 4th, because it's just a political hoax. And he was pressed by Guthrie to disavow QAnon. And he kept saying, I don't know anything about it. And then when he was pressed, he said, well, I do know that they're very much against pedophilia. They fight it very hard. But it's not Jeffrey Epstein's pedophilia. It's not the Roman Catholic Church pedophilia. It's a claim that Democratic politicians have a ring of child sex trafficking. But the only, evidence-based claims about politicians and pedophilia are almost exclusively about Republicans. And I find it a very confounding phenomenon, QAnon, to begin with. But that he wants to, try to straddle and hope to get some votes from QAnon advocates, or I don't know what you call them, the faithful. And at one point, when he was pressed about his tax returns, he still claims that because he's under audit, his lawyers just advise him that it's not a good idea to release those returns. And we all know that's bullshit. But when asked about the report of the New York Times that he only paid $750 in taxes in 2016 and 2017, he didn't dispute that. He made it sound like it was a filing fee or something like that. And for the guy who, practices tax evasion, even tax fraud at a very high level, you'd think he'd have a better idea. Now, one of the things I'll give credit to Joe Biden for is that he was asked about this question of a smooth transition, a transfer of power after the election. And he said, look, if I lose, I'll go back to teaching at wherever he's teaching in Pennsylvania. I don't know too much about that. And Trump even alluded to that he might lose. And he revved back up his, claims of fraud and a rigged election. But in between there, he kind of admitted that he might lose and that he might accept the outcome. So that's a little bit different. Of course, it's all performance. We can't rely on the claims of the stable genius at any given moment. And here's the Washington Post update on the takeaways from the 2 town halls. They praise Savannah Guthrie. They say in the 20 minutes of Q&A between Guthrie and Trump, she thoroughly grilled him. Trump repeated a series of false claims, about the coronavirus outbreak, equivocated on QAnon and accepting the election results. Trump claimed a study showed 85% of people who wear masks still get coronavirus, and Guthrie noted that that was a false description of a study. Also, related to Biden, he didn't make any glaring mistakes, and I commented to Kathy after I watched some of his performance last night that he has shaken off the incoherence that troubled so many of us in the primary. And while he still has some, speech patterns that you might criticize, Trump's are far worse. I mean, his limited vocabulary, his need to be repetitious. I don't think either one of them has grounds to criticize the verbal skills of the other. And also, Guthrie cornered him on denouncing white supremacism, and that's where Trump really got angry. And it shows that even though he had a moment here where he's not on Fox, he's not talking to Foxy Friends or Rush Limbaugh, but presumably the audience of NBC and its cable channels is a little broader than Fox and One America News. And he had an opportunity to expand his base to try to appeal to people who are telling pollsters they're not supporting him. And he didn't do that. He is hunkered down, believing that turning out his base, that continuing to feed them high-protein red meat, is going to secure this election for him. And I think he badly miscalculates because, while I'm not Joe Biden's biggest fan, I can observe that he doesn't carry the deep negatives of Hillary Clinton, even though Biden has a record twice as long as Hillary's and riddled with problematic positions. He did admit that his crime bills in the early 90s were a mistake. And he, mentioned that he had a lot of support from the Black Caucus and others. He didn't take full responsibility for it. But it was a step. Here's a comment that came in by email from a guy named Paul, and he's listened to me on a local radio station here in San Francisco, and I think he listens to the podcast now. He says the more likely explanation, this is regarding Biden and the pack the court discussion. He's just using a stalling tactic, much as Trump did on the topic of releasing his taxes. Biden knows that if he doesn't follow through, there won't be enough time before the election for Republicans to capitalize on a broken promise. I also think that Biden is truly conflicted on the topic. I, for one, do not think the Democrats should worry so much about public response should they pack the courts, nor do I think they should be so worried about the risk of repeated court-size changes. First of all, I don't think that Republicans would hesitate for a moment if the tables were turned. Second, given that our country is moving away from a white majority, I think it is inevitable that today's Republican Party is going to be losing their grip on power over time. Already, much of the power Republicans wield is dependent on past gerrymandering and ongoing voter suppression. The current Trump administration is likely the last big hurrah of the Republican Party, and their power will now wane over time. At least that is my hope. And as I've expressed before, I think that Biden and Harris have made a tactical error in dodging the question about packing the court. It's a straw man argument. And all they have to say is, it's a straw man argument. And instead they say, oh, I won't answer that question. And that is the dumbest way to dodge a question. And I think that Biden he's well in his rights to say, look, Pete Buttigieg brought that up during the primary, not me. I didn't embrace it. It's not on my agenda. Next question. Or he could say, if he wanted to throw some, a loss of equilibrium to Republicans, he could say, well, I'm going to form a commission to study that, but I haven't taken a position. So that's my free advice to the Democratic presidential campaign. Now, Nancy Pelosi's in a pickle. And while I have my differences with a woman who I worked for as a campaign consultant more than 25 years ago, no, it's 24 years ago. Sorry, I don't want to exaggerate. I support her in her current position related to negotiating with the Trump administration and Steve Mnuchin over an additional bailout package from Washington. And I'm seeing a lot of sniping, mostly from people who already hate Nancy Pelosi. And despite my differences, I don't hate her. I think that she is a great speaker who understands the demands of the office. And I think that she has skillfully held her position, having passed the so-called HEROES Act back in May, seen the silence from the Republicans all summer, and now they're desperate for something. They want a fig leaf. And I'm surprised that Ro Khanna, a more progressive congressman from Silicon Valley, has taken the lead internally criticizing Pelosi in the caucus and suggesting that the offer that was made by Mnuchin a week ago at roughly the $1.8 trillion level is something that Pelosi should simply accept. The problem is she would be sticking her neck out and trusting Trump and Mnuchin to be able to deliver the Republicans in the U.S. Senate. Mitch McConnell's been pretty blunt that he doesn't have the votes because his caucus, the Republicans in the Senate, are loath to give any kind of a perceived political victory to Pelosi and to the Democrats. And they'd rather see people starve and get evicted, lose their health insurance, and imagine that they can still hold their own in the November election. And I was particularly disappointed to see the local San Francisco Chronicle, which has become increasingly corporate and conservative, chide Pelosi today in an editorial and say that she ought to just cave and give in. But if she does that, she can be double-crossed by the Republicans. Because Trump, despite a claim he made on the town hall last night, does not have the power to deliver the Republicans in the Senate, especially at this point when they think he's going down. So it's a very dicey situation. But there was that interview this week where Wolf Blitzer took her on and said, people are hungry, people are, threatened with eviction. And he was trying to get her to cave in and take an offer from the Republicans that is not in hand. And I think that she smells that rat and is properly holding out. And she may not get anything before the election. But I believe that will benefit Democrats more than Republicans politically. And the crumbs that the Republicans are offering, as if $1,200 is going to bail anybody out, I don't think are worth it. Now, I'll contradict myself a bit here because a new study has come out that showed that the $1,200 payments and the increased unemployment benefits that came out of the CARES Act in April and May did prop up the lower classes in America, the lower income groups. But since the money has been cut off, the number of poor people has grown by 8 million across the country since May. And I do believe that despite being very wealthy herself and under the influence of corporate donors, I know Pelosi well enough that she does feel the pain of suffering Americans. And to the extent that our politics today permit that, she's trying to fight for the little people. Well, our petty tyrant of a president has followed through on a threat to punish California because we didn't properly sweep our forests. The Trump administration has rejected California's request for a routine disaster declaration for 6 destructive wildfires that burned hundreds of thousands of acres across the state. Now, it gets a little confusing because we've had waves of wildfires, and this particular request was related to the 5 major fires that plagued the state starting in the month of September. There were other fires that started by lightning in mid-August, and Trump had already approved the disaster declaration for that round of conflagration. Anyway, Governor Newsom wrote a letter on September 28th, a routine request. He outlined the financial impact of the wildfires. But the White House said that the request was rejected because it was not supported by the relevant data. More bullshit from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And while we're under a red flag warning until later today, we're on our 3rd day of 90-degree temperatures, bone-dry humidity, and high onshore winds. I've heard no reports of fresh outbreak of fire here in Northern California, but we have been on watch the last few days, and some people have had preemptive power shutoffs. Fortunately, I'm not one of those customers of the rogue utility PG&E. But I want to note, halfway across the world, fire broke out 5 days ago in the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro. That, of course, is Africa's highest mountain, located mostly in Kenya. The fires started to burn at a rest stop for climbers. They've been raging for 5 days with dry grass, strong winds, hampering efforts to bring the flames under control. And more on the Planet Watch. Nearly half of the United States is in a worsening drought. It's evident here on the West Coast, where we are facing a La Niña winter weather pattern, which in simple terms means very little rain. And we've been in a drought mode on and off for the last 5 or 6 years. Forecasters say this is the most widespread drought in the continental U.S. since 2013, covering more than 45% of the lower 48 states. And I'm looking at a beautiful aerial color photograph in today's New York Times of the reservoir behind the Boquilla Dam, which is in Chihuahua State in northern Mexico. Chihuahua borders the Rio Grande, and the Boquilla Dam, I can't quite tell here. It looks like it does receive water from a tributary of the Rio Grande River. But the reservoir there is drying up, and farmers in Chihuahua have taken control of the dam. And they are refusing to allow any more of the water, their water, to flow to the United States. Now, there is a treaty that allows the U.S. to access some of the water from the Boquilla Dam and its reservoir. And President AMLO, who I have to say, as time goes on, I have less and less respect for him, largely because of his capitulation to Trump. He has assured the United States that Mexico will make good on its water obligations, whether the state of Chihuahua likes it or not. AMLO, I think you ought to listen to your people. Uncle Sam will survive. And our petty tyrant is operating on another front, penalizing the city of Portland, Oregon. And he threatened about a month ago to cut off funding to Portland because of the ongoing protests there. The part of his ginned-up drama, dispatching his own palace guard the federal troops on the streets of Portland who went well beyond any jurisdiction to protect federal property. So a notice published last week to alert local governments of a $10 million federal grant to develop ways to improve transit agencies and enhance the mobility of transit users. In the notice, it says that Portland is not eligible for this grant money. So it's not a big, $10 million is the entire federal account. Portland would just get a small portion of that. But it is a signal of just how petty and petulant this man aims to be. And the protests do continue in Portland. They were on the street again last night. Couple of arrests. Fires were started in trash, piles of trash on the street. And that's pretty much the size of it. I think 2 people were arrested for failing to follow orders. Actually, one of them was arrested for adding lighter fluid or gasoline to one of those trash fires that was burning in the streets. Well, we've been following Jason Leopold's latest FOIA lawsuit, and I've got more details here in a BuzzFeed story today. He, of course, has FOIA'd the tweeted message from the president that he has ordered all documents related to the Russia investigation completely declassified without redactions. And he tweeted a message to that effect last week. And what's fascinating is that the judge presiding over this case is one Reggie Walton. And if my memory serves, and often it does, but I can't say it's 1,000% reliable. You may know that Jason Leopold, back in 2004, reported that Karl Rove had been indicted by a grand jury in Washington, D.C. That was a case presided over by Reggie Walton. And the information, for whatever reason, did not bear out. It appears that some insiders misled Leopold, but it's also possible that they had returned a secret indictment and then it was quashed. So I never have discovered the bottom of that story. But Reggie Walton is not taking the representations of the Justice Department that presidential tweets are not credible orders from the guy in the White House. So he has issued a directive saying that he wants the president himself or somebody close to him who actually talks to Trump to confirm to the court that these orders should be taken literally. Because the government's position has been, no, don't take them literally. These are just, PR statements for public consumption. But Walton said that the government attorney's assertion that the October 6 tweets were ambiguous, he said he didn't agree with that. He said the president stated he has fully authorized the total declassification of any and all documents pertaining to the Russian investigation, that those are unambiguous and clearly indicated his intent. I don't think anything more is required, says Walton. And he went on, the American public has a right to rely on what a president says his intent is. So he ordered the department to file by Tuesday a declaration by the president or an individual who has conferred directly with him regarding whether the president intended to order the declassification and release without redaction of the Russiagate documents. Here's another issue about a presidential tweet. He announced on the Twitter machine that all of our troops from Afghanistan would be home for Christmas. Maybe he only meant half of the 4,500 who are there today. So to clarify, we get word from Robert O'Brien, the current National Security Advisor. I can guarantee you that's the plan of the president. And that was a reference to the dismissal of this order by the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who called the matter speculation. And O'Brien said it's not speculation, it's an order of the Commander-in-Chief, and the Defense Department and its secretary are fully on board and implementing these orders. And Trump Co., as I mentioned at the top, does seem to appear that they may lose. And so they are scrambling to complete some dirty projects. So they're trying to lock in what are actually rule rollbacks but are considered new because they've been modified. One would allow railroads to move highly flammable liquefied natural gas on freight trains, bomb trains. They are also monkeying around with immigration rules. At the Labor Department, independent contractor rules, which are the subject of a voter initiative, number 22 here in California, which I am strongly opposed to. So this is somewhat common, where this happened in the final months of the Obama administration. They knew their time was up, and so they tried to affect their policies through rulemaking. And some of those, under a congressional act, were reversed in the early days of the Trump administration. And should the Democrats take control of the White House and the Senate, they will be able to unwind some of these modifications in the early part of next year. So earlier I referred to my self-styled humility, and I have another self-aggrandizing statement to make for you today, and that was I have been predicting for months that the Hunter Biden-Ukraine story would be making a comeback in advance of the election. And sure enough, with a helping hand from Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon, this material that we're told surfaced from a laptop computer that Hunter Biden left at a repair shop in Wilmington, Delaware, that had salacious videos of him smoking crack and banging somebody. Also included incriminating emails about Burisma. Now this has been suppressed by social media, which of course only makes it more attractive to the curious. And so there is a kind of takedown piece at the Huffington Post today. They describe the origins of this information, the handoff from Giuliani to the Murdoch-controlled New York Post. And the central allegation is that Hunter Biden introduced his father to the number 3 executive at Burisma and that they met in Washington, D.C., if these emails are credible. Now, one of the interesting points to be made is that so far we have heard that Biden never met with this guy, never heard of the guy. But we haven't heard a direct denial that this was Hunter's laptop and that these emails are real. And I remain skeptical of this whole sequence. I do see it as a political October surprise with a lot of shady characters in the chain of custody of the alleged information. And I remain offended and critical of Twitter and Facebook for running interference for the Biden campaign. They've allowed all kinds of nonsense to be posted on Twitter time and again, especially by Trump. I'm not excluding others, but especially him. And so now these moves to limit access to this information, which does appear to be sketchy, I think are just ham-handed and they're going to backfire. So Trump called Facebook and Twitter terrible. He called them monsters. Oh, I thought that was Kamala Harris's tag. Come on, Trump. Can't you come up with more than a couple of insulting names? On Fox, prominent conservative hosts blasted the social media platforms as monopolies, accused them of censorship and election interference. Well, both have some merit. Simmering discontent among Republicans over the power of Facebook and Twitter that they wield over public discourse has erupted into open acrimony. The Trump campaign said Twitter had locked its official account after it tried to promote the article, and Twitter then doubled down by prohibiting the spread of a different New York Post article about the Bidens, the one that I shared with you yesterday, about the alleged efforts to generate high-income consulting deals in China. So both Twitter and Facebook are on the defensive. And yesterday I made the point that they are publishers because they are deciding what gets posted and what doesn't, either through robotic algorithms or by decisions that are made by humans. So now Ajit Pai, who is the Republican chair of the Federal Communications Commission, said he plans to move forward with a proceeding to clarify Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which makes it impossible to sue web platforms over much of the content posted by their users or how they choose to. And, of course, he's getting pressure from Trump to do something. And I just still believe that this is moving in the wrong direction. And this just really knocked me over today. In the New York Times, a major promoter of Russiagate, they talk about the misinformation that is posted primarily on Facebook, but also Twitter. And then they cite the German Marshall Fund, which has been one of the major drivers of Russiagate, providing false data, I think it's false, about bot activity and highly exaggerating the role of the Internet Research Agency in making up Facebook posts that somehow poisoned the minds of voters in 2016. So the Times, referring to the Marshall Fund, then cites its partnership with NewsGuard. NewsGuard has kind of come and gone, but it was an effort to put a stamp of approval on mainstream media propaganda and, by default, disapprove of independent voices on the left or the right who don't toe the line that corporate media sets. So they're now saying that the amount of falsehoods and misleading content has tripled from the third quarter of 2016 to the third quarter of 2020. And what delighted me is, as one example, they include the Palmer Report. And people, share the Palmer Report with me on Facebook. And it's written by this Democratic hack named Palmer. It was part of the media offense back in 2016, run by a dark money super PAC controlled by David Brock. And Palmer is still out there, and he takes one little factoid, one little bit of truthiness, and then spins up what I consider to be Democratic catnip, things that people really want to hear. So I want to recommend Glenn Greenwald's essay about this whole episode, and I've got so much to cover here, I'm not going to go into much detail and quote it heavily, but I generally agree with the positions that Greenwald is taking here. He's skeptical of the story itself, but he notes that the overreaction by Facebook and Twitter creates a climate of extreme hostility and suppression toward the Post, and, as I pointed out, it just makes people more curious about this stuff. They're using a bad form of reverse psychology, and if they think that their efforts actually do reduce the number of people who find and read and then believe this stuff, well, they are seriously delusional. Every day I pause for a minute to acknowledge the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions, people like Carl Howard, Clifford Johnson, Jim Garrison, and Janet Price. I appreciate you folks, and I want to thank you for your support over these years, As you may know, I'm going to be winding down the podcast and ending the daily podcast, and I'm going to take a break for a couple of months. I may return next year with infrequent posts, could be interviews, could be a news and comments style. I really haven't decided, but I am easing into retirement, and roughly 2 weeks after the election is resolved, whenever that is, that'll be the point where I hang up my headphones here on the daily feed. Election problems continue to surface. Counties in Ohio and Pennsylvania are relying on a commercial printer in Cleveland called Midwest Direct to print up millions of mail-in ballots. But Midwest Direct, which is run by a couple of brothers named Gebbe, Richard Gebbe and his brother James, they fly a Trump flag over their business headquarters. And now, son of a gun, in Pennsylvania, nearly 30,000 ballots sent to voters in Allegheny County, that's Pittsburgh, a liberal part of Pennsylvania, went to the wrong address. And there are other errors that are popping up, including an inability to deliver these ballots to election officers on time. And a federal judge in Tennessee issued a blistering dissent in a case that was reported on this week. The hero for me here is Judge Karen Nelson Moore. And on Thursday, she accused her colleagues and other judges across the country of sanctioning a systematic effort to suppress voter turnout and undermine the right to vote. She sits on the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit in Nashville, and she wrote a scathing dissent in a case about how Tennessee handles absentee voting. She disagreed with her two colleagues in the majority, who rejected a challenge to the state's signature match rules for mail-in ballots. But she went further, criticizing judges across the U.S. who have sided with states seeking to limit mail-in voting this year. Moore called the decision another drop in the bucket that is the degradation of the right to vote in this country. Hiding behind closed courthouse doors does not change the fact that ruling by ruling, many courts are chipping away at votes that ought to be counted. It's a disgrace to the federal court's foundational role in ensuring democracy's function, and a betrayal to the persons that wish to participate in it fully. And let me turn to the last page here and get her final comment. As a result of today's decision, Tennessee is free to and will disenfranchise hundreds, if not thousands, of its citizens who cast their votes absentee by mail. Masking today's outcome in standing doctrine obscures that result, but that makes it all the more disquieting. I will not be a party to this passive sanctioning of disenfranchisement. I dissent. Good for you, Your Honor. So, as I mentioned, I filled out my mail-in ballot, and I've deposited it in a safe drop box for my election office here in California. And when I went through the ballot, I was puzzled to see that Kanye West is listed as the VP candidate of the American Independent Party. Now, I've seen the AIP on my ballot before. I've never voted for an American Independent Party candidate. But Rocky de la Fuente is a chronic candidate, or a perennial one, for president, under this party's tag. And it's an interesting historical note that this party was founded in 1967 to boost the presidential hopes of segregationist Governor George Wallace of Alabama. So what's funny about this is that the vice chair of the American Independent Party's Central Committee said, we've tried to get in touch with Kanye, but we haven't had any luck yet. We actually wanted to put him on the top of the ticket. But since Kanye didn't really contact us, De La Fuente was the only person who requested the nomination. And Kanye is on the ballot as a presidential candidate in 10 states. And I cannot explain what his strategy or Trump's is in this quest, because it's clear that Trump lawyers have helped him get on the ballot in those 10 states. I don't get it. I really don't. Couple of stories here. I credit the LA Times for keeping the heat on the rogue sheriff's department in Los Angeles County. On Wednesday, they reported that 2 deputies who were guarding a 3rd deputy who's hospitalized at UCLA fired 7 shots and critically wounded a 34-year-old psychiatric patient who was having an episode. So this occurred around midnight, and the psychiatric patient was wielding something. It was a blunt object that weighed about 5 pounds. So he threw some sort of a scene that caused one of the deputies on guard to go down the hall to see what was happening. She found a patient not identified in a hospital gown trying to smash a window with a 6.5-pound compression device. Moments later, he approached the room where the deputies were guarding their colleague. They heard banging in the hallway, and then the window of the door to the room they were guarding was shattered, and the patient was holding this device over his head. So one of the deputies stepped onto the threshold to block him from entering, ordered him to put the thing down, and they say, without benefit of any surveillance footage or a body cam, that he lunged forward, and then a deputy opened fire 7 times, striking him in his upper body. Now, this is a bizarre case, and a lot of bizarre things have been happening with the L.A. County deputy sheriffs. And as you know, a few weeks back, Dijon Kizzee was killed by deputies who stopped him because he was riding his bicycle on the wrong side of the street. And after Kizzee tried to flee, the cops claimed that he was reaching for a gun, and they shot and killed him. The LA Times has done some research. There have been 15 similar incidents since 2005, averaging roughly 1 per year. So in addition to Dijon Kizzee, Christian Cobian, 26 years old, was stopped by deputies because his bike didn't have lights. He ran from the cops. They fired 13 rounds, killing him. And while they thought he had a gun, no gun was found. And among the 16 cases, the violations ranged from riding on the sidewalk to biking without a light or on the wrong side of the road. In 11 cases, authorities said they found a firearm. In one shooting, it was an airsoft gun that they thought was a semi-automatic pistol. And this speaks to one of my arguments, and it echoes New York's Attorney General Letitia James, who's recommended that police stop conducting routine traffic stops. And I agree, it's a flashpoint that often develops or devolves into a deadly incident. I want to recommend Kevin Gostola's account of the lawsuit that's been filed by Consortium News against the Canadian broadcaster Global News. And we've talked about this, and we interviewed Joe Laria back, it was early part of the year, January or February. And I did reach Laria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News, but he declined to do an interview because his attorneys have instructed him to maintain radio silence. But I think it's a fascinating story where Consortium News, and this occurred under its founding editor, the late Robert Parry, published a story that revealed that a top-ranking Canadian official, Chrystia Freeland, had lied about her grandfather's connections to the Nazis. And as she was running for election to an important post in 2019, the story resurfaced, and based on the Canadian equivalent to the NSA, the CSE, there was a published claim that Consortium News was a tool of the Russian government. And I'm pretty confident that that's not true. So Consortium News has sued for slander. Also want to recommend a piece by Raul Diego at Mint Press News. He's kind of dismissive of Democratic Congressman David Price of North Carolina, who is all of a sudden demanding that the CIA disclose the role of an airport facility in North Carolina in the rendition and torture program of the CIA. And I recommend the piece because he goes into some detail about a particular plane that carried the tail number. Let me find it here. N313P, and it was plane spotters whose reports were published in a book that I still treasure called Torture Taxi. And it was published by A.C. Thompson, who's now a great investigative reporter at ProPublica. He's been covering the white extremist groups in this country, and his colleague Trevor Paglin. And based on the plane spotters' information, they were able to track a number of the rendition flights conducted by the United States. So I recommend this to you. I think that it might fill in some gaps you may have about what was going on during the Bush administration years. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis with my appreciation. In the U.S., we're now at 8 million cases. The daily case count is rising up to 63,000 yesterday, with 892 new deaths reported, bringing the total to just under 217,000. And coronavirus is surging in all but 11 states right now. Reports of new cases have trended upward in all but 11 states. More than 65,000 cases were announced across the country on Thursday. That's the most in a single day since July. Uncontrolled outbreaks in the Midwest and Mountain West are driving this. North Dakota and South Dakota are still adding more new cases per capita than any states have since the start of the pandemic. And Michael Osterholm at University of Minnesota says what's happening in the upper Midwest is just a harbinger of things to come in the rest of the country. And this is personally disappointing because one of the things I've been planning to do when I retire in a few weeks here is drive up to Canada and go skiing for a while. I really love the mountains at Whistler and Blackcomb, east of Vancouver. But Justin Trudeau has said his country is committed to keeping the border closed until the U.S. gets its shit together. He actually said until it gets control of COVID-19. A UN health agency announced today the results of the largest randomized trial of COVID-19 treatments. The 6-month-long study found conclusive evidence that remdesivir has little or no effect on severe cases. It's not yet peer-reviewed, but they found that 4 treatments tested, remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, I'm not sure about that drug, and interferon, all had little or no effect on whether or not patients died within about a month or whether hospitalized patients recovered. Chris Christie says he was in intensive care, and in a public apology of sorts, he said that he was wrong not to wear a mask at the White House. He's 58, he's morbidly obese, which is putting it charitably, and he has asthma. He said, I believed when I entered the White House grounds, that was back at the Rose Garden party for Amy Coney Barrett, that I had entered a safe zone due to the testing that I and many others underwent every day. I was wrong. I was wrong not to wear a mask at the Amy Barrett announcement. I was wrong not to wear a mask at my multiple debate prep sessions with the president and the rest of the team. I hope that my experience shows my fellow citizens you should follow CDC guidelines. Don't tell Trump. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts has asked the 2 U.S. financial market regulators to investigate whether the Trump administration's private warnings back in February to the Hoover Institution at Stanford about the potential economic harm of the pandemic spurred insider trading. And I'm glad to hear this because, based on the reports we have, that's exactly what happened. And Pfizer Pharmaceutical Chief Executive Dr. Albert Bourla said today that although Pfizer could have preliminary numbers by the end of October about the vaccine that they have in a clinical trial, it would still need to collect safety and manufacturing data that would stretch the approval to late November. Couple of other quick items here on COVID. The Navy has said that 2 sailors aboard the nuclear-powered Roosevelt, which had that big outbreak and went into Guam under the command of Captain Brett Crozier, who I think is a hero for trying to protect his crew. Well, 2 more sailors have tested positive. The ship is now in port in San Diego. The NFL is having problems because the Patriots have canceled a practice. The Colts have shut down their facility, and we'll see what happens on Sunday. Also, experts are saying that while Trump has claimed and his doctors have reported that he is not infectious, there is no test for infectiousness. There's also no test for a cure, which Trump has claimed he found with the Regeneron monoclonal antibodies. Okay, a couple of quick more stories here because I've just got to share these with you. In New York, there is a plan now to erect a statue of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in Brooklyn, probably in Flatbush, and I certainly support that. But RBG, when she joined the faculty of Rutgers Law School way back in 1963, she discovered that she was paid less than her male peers. So she and other female faculty members mounted a legal challenge against the university, and they thought they had won parity. But Wednesday, 5 current tenured professors at Rutgers filed a lawsuit accusing the university of paying them far less than their male counterparts. And these amounts for tenured professors range from $25,000 to $46,000 per year. One of the professors said she estimated that she would have earned more than $300,000 additional if she'd been paid at the same rate as colleagues, and another said her amount would be $500,000. I want to recommend a couple of things for your weekend viewing. Online at YouTube, look for #SOSFest. It'll be a live stream concert event from Friday through Sunday, and it is a fundraiser to help the people who are roadies and producers and technicians and ticket takers, all of the people who are in the support positions in the live music production business. And it'll feature Foo Fighters. That's happening, I don't know when. Also The Roots and Dave Matthews Band's band. Those are some of the headliners. And on your TV screen, on Netflix, available today, is a film written by and directed by Aaron Sorkin. It's The Trial of the Chicago 7. And I can't wait to see this. The review I have here indicates that it's focused on Tom Hayden, who became a kind of friend. We weren't close personally, but I interviewed Tom many times, and we had a lot of great moments. And he, of course, was one of the 7, it was originally 8, who were tried before Judge Julius Hoffman in a kangaroo court following the events of the police riot at the 1968 Democratic Convention. So I'll be looking for that with great interest, and if you're part of my generation, I think you'll want to check it out as well. And I'll mention that my brother Dan, his late father-in-law, whose name was Franklin McMahon, was the courtroom artist for Time and Life magazine at the Chicago 7 trial. And Dan and his wife Margot have an incredible drawing of the evil Judge Hoffman. Right, it's over their mantle in their living room in a Chicago suburb. And it's something that reminds me of that ugly trial every time I visit. Thanks for listening to my Ranting and Raving, my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I am Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.